Nobody at Lenovo stood up at a press conference and said the words, "We don't need Microsoft's permission anymore." No executive put that exact sentence in a press release. But if you look closely at what the world's biggest PC maker actually did this year, that sentence is the only honest way to describe it. Lenovo didn't ask Microsoft for anything. It didn't negotiate a better deal, didn't lobby for cheaper licensing, didn't wait for permission to change how it does business. It just quietly rewired the default setup on 60% of its laptop lineup, made Windows something you now have to specifically ask for and pay extra to get, and moved on. That's not a request. That's a company acting like the permission it used to need simply isn't necessary anymore. This is the story of how the largest PC manufacturer on the planet, the company that ships more laptops than anyone else on Earth, quietly stopped treating Windows as the default and started treating it as an optional extra, and why that single decision might matter more to Microsoft's future than almost anything else happening in the Windows versus Linux story this year. It's worth being upfront about the framing in this video's title before going any further, because precision matters more than drama here. That specific sentence, "We don't need Microsoft's permission anymore," isn't a verified, on-the-record quote from any named Lenovo or HP executive. Nobody has publicly said those exact words in an interview or press statement that this video could point to directly. What follows is this channel's own interpretation of what a very real, very well-documented set of business decisions actually represents in practice. And once you see the numbers behind those decisions, you'll understand why that framing fits, even without a single company ever needing to say it out loud. Let's start with the actual scale of what Lenovo did, because the number here is the whole story, and it's worth being precise about it before drawing any broader conclusions. Lenovo controls roughly 27% of the global PC market, more than any other manufacturer on the planet, ahead of HP, Dell, Apple, and every other name you'd typically think of first. This year, Lenovo made Linux the default operating system on 60% of its laptop lineup, not an available option buried 3 clicks deep on a configuration page. The default, the thing that ships when you don't go out of your way to change it. Windows, meanwhile, became the opposite of default, something you have to actively select and pay an additional fee for if you specifically want it. Sit with that for a second, because the framing matters enormously. For the entire history of consumer computing, default has been one of the single most powerful forces shaping what operating system regular people actually end up using. Most people never change the operating system a computer ships with. They buy what's in front of them, and whatever came pre-installed becomes, for the overwhelming majority of buyers, simply what their computer is, without any further evaluation ever entering the picture. Windows built and maintained its dominance for over 3 decades, largely by being that default on nearly every machine, at nearly every retailer, everywhere in the world. Lenovo flipping that default on 60% of its lineup for the single largest PC manufacturer on the planet isn't a cosmetic change. It's an attack on the exact mechanism that made Windows unavoidable in the first place. And Lenovo isn't acting alone here, which is the detail that turns this from an interesting one-company story into something that looks a lot more like an industry-wide shift rather than a single outlier making an unusual bet. HP, the second largest PC manufacturer in the world, has reportedly been moving in almost exactly the same direction. Multiple industry reports this year describe HP dropping Windows from its default laptop configuration in favor of Linux, with Windows still technically available, but only if you specifically request it and pay the additional cost yourself. HP reportedly ran an extensive internal trial throughout 2025, testing Linux as an alternative default for customers before making this broader move. That's not a company reacting impulsively to a single bad headline. That's a company that spent a year testing the idea, gathering real data, and deciding those results justified making the switch permanent. Dell and Asus, according to the same reporting, have been offering Linux as an alternative to the default Windows install for a while now, and are reportedly considering following Lenovo and HP's lead in making the switch to Linux as the actual default, rather than just an available option for customers who already know to go looking for it on a configuration page. Most casual buyers never bother to explore. If even 2 of those 4, Lenovo and HP, the 2 largest PC manufacturers on Earth combined, have already made this move and Dell and Asus are seriously considering it, you're no longer looking at a niche experiment. You're looking at a majority of the entire global PC manufacturing industry either already treating Linux as the default or actively weighing whether to. Let's talk about why this is actually happening, because the reasoning here is almost entirely financial, and it's worth being precise about the actual numbers driving this decision, rather than treating it as some kind of ideological statement about open source software or a sudden philosophical conversion at either company. Microsoft charges PC manufacturers a licensing royalty for every single copy of Windows that ships pre-installed on a new machine. That fee has been a quiet, largely invisible cost baked into the price of nearly every Windows laptop sold for decades. Invisible to consumers, but very much felt by manufacturers operating on notoriously thin hardware margins. Linux carries no equivalent licensing cost at all. For a company shipping tens of millions of laptops a year, even a modest per-unit licensing fee adds up to a genuinely enormous number once you multiply it across that kind of volume. It's not just the raw licensing fee either. Windows 11's hardware requirements, the TPM 2.0 security chip specifically, add real, measurable manufacturing cost to every machine that needs to support it, on top of the software licensing fee itself. Linux carries no equivalent hardware requirement, meaning manufacturers can build to a lower cost floor across the board when Linux is the target operating system instead of Windows. Add in the fact that Windows-focused laptops are widely reported to need roughly twice the RAM as an equivalent Linux machine to deliver comparable everyday performance. A real difference in bill of materials cost across an entire product line, and the financial case for Linux as a default from a manufacturer's perspective starts looking less like an ideological preference and considerably more like straightforward cost engineering. There's also a customer experience angle here that Lenovo specifically has been vocal about, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as corporate spin. Lenovo has reported that its own internal data from offering Linux configurations shows meaningfully lower product return rates and fewer customer support calls compared to equivalent Windows machines, along with real, measurable per-unit cost savings once you account for the reduced hardware requirements and eliminated licensing fee, reportedly in the neighborhood of $100 per unit once everything is factored in. For a company operating at Lenovo's scale, shipping tens of millions of units annually, $100 of savings per unit isn't a rounding error. It's a genuinely enormous number, multiplied across an enormous volume that goes straight to the bottom line. It's worth understanding just how central that OEM licensing revenue has historically been to Microsoft's entire Windows business, because it helps explain exactly why this specific kind of pressure is so uniquely uncomfortable for the company. For most of Windows history, the licensing fee manufacturers paid per unit shipped represented one of the most reliable, predictable revenue streams in Microsoft's entire portfolio. Money that arrived automatically with every single laptop and desktop sold by every major manufacturer, without Microsoft needing to do any additional marketing or sales work to earn it beyond maintaining the relationships that kept Windows as the default in the first place. That's an extraordinarily efficient business model. Get baked into the default configuration once, and collect revenue on every unit sold afterward, indefinitely, with minimal ongoing sales effort required. That efficiency is exactly what makes Lenovo and HP's shift so structurally significant rather than just a minor line item concern. This isn't Microsoft losing a few individual retail customers who each represent a single lost sale. This is Microsoft's own hardware partners removing the automatic revenue mechanism at the source for a majority of specific product lines before those units are ever manufactured. Every laptop that ships with Linux as the default instead of Windows represents a licensing fee Microsoft will never collect on that specific unit, multiplied across millions of units annually for as long as this default configuration remains in place. That's a fundamentally different and considerably harder to reverse kind of revenue loss than losing individual customers one at a time to a competing platform. Let's talk about what Linux distribution these manufacturers are actually shipping when they make this switch, because it's not some obscure, unpolished, developer-only build that would scare off a typical buyer. Manufacturers shipped Linux configurations. Machines like these tend to run polished, consumer-oriented distributions, specifically chosen for broad hardware compatibility and ease of use out of the box, with the manufacturer's own driver support built directly into the image before it ever reaches a customer. This channel has spent considerable time covering exactly this category of beginner-friendly, professionally maintained Linux distribution, the kind designed specifically so a typical buyer, including one who's never touched Linux, before can turn the machine on and start using it immediately, without needing to understand anything about package managers or terminal commands to get through their first day with the computer. It's worth being fair to Microsoft's side of this story too, because the full picture matters, and it would be dishonest to pretend this shift happens in a vacuum without any real counter-arguments. Windows still offers meaningfully broader software compatibility for a huge range of specialized professional and enterprise applications that simply don't have a clean Linux equivalent yet. Gaming, while it's closed an enormous amount of ground thanks to Steam and Proton, as we've covered extensively on this channel, still isn't at complete parity with Windows for every single title, particularly ones protected by aggressive kernel-level anti-cheat systems. And for a huge population of casual, non-technical users, Windows remains the platform they're already comfortable with, built on decades of institutional familiarity that a fresh Linux install, however polished, can't instantly replicate. None of what Lenovo and HP are doing eliminates those real, legitimate reasons plenty of customers will still actively choose Windows for themselves, even when it costs them extra to do so. But here's why this shift matters so much more than any single customer's individual choice, and it's the entire reason this story earns the framing in this video's title. The power of a default has never really been about giving customers a meaningfully informed choice between two equally presented options. It's about exploiting the fact that most people never make an active choice at all. When Windows was the default on nearly every machine, on nearly every store shelf, the vast majority of buyers simply accepted whatever came pre-installed without ever seriously evaluating an alternative. Not because Windows definitively won some fair, informed comparison in their minds, but because changing the default requires active effort most casual buyers were never going to make. Lenovo and HP flipping that exact mechanism into Linux's favor doesn't require convincing a single casual buyer that Linux is technically superior to Windows. It just requires the same passive default acceptance behavior that built Windows' dominance in the first place, now quietly working in the opposite direction. Think about how many millions of Windows installations over the decades came from exactly this passive mechanism rather than any deliberate, considered choice. Someone needs a new laptop, walks into a store or opens a website, picks something in their budget with the specs they need, and never once seriously stops to ask whether a different operating system might genuinely suit them better. That's not a failure of judgment on the buyer's part. It's simply how most consumer purchasing decisions actually work, for laptops and for nearly everything else people buy. Manufacturers have always understood this dynamic intimately, which is exactly why the default configuration on a product page carries so much more real-world weight than the mere existence of alternative configuration options ever could. Lenovo and HP aren't fighting Microsoft on the terrain of convincing skeptical buyers Linux is better. They're fighting on the much more consequential terrain of who gets to be the passive, unexamined default choice for the millions of buyers who will never actively compare the two at all. That's the real structural significance behind a company simply changing what ships out of the box without asking anyone's permission first. Microsoft has spent decades benefiting enormously from manufacturer defaults it never had to fight particularly hard to maintain because switching away from the entrenched default has always carried enough friction for both manufacturers and customers that the status quo tended to reinforce itself automatically. Lenovo and HP didn't need Microsoft's permission to break that cycle. They didn't need a public antitrust ruling, a landmark court case, or a dramatic regulatory intervention. They simply looked at their own cost structure, their own return rate data, their own customer support numbers, and made an internal business decision that Microsoft had no actual power to veto, block, or negotiate away from happening. The permission Microsoft used to functionally hold over what ships as the default operating system on the world's most popular laptops has quietly evaporated, not through confrontation, but through two of Microsoft's own longtime hardware partners simply deciding they no longer needed to ask. It's worth thinking about how genuinely unusual this specific kind of pressure is for Microsoft to respond to, because it doesn't fit the shape of any threat the company has faced before. A rival operating system trying to win market share directly is a threat Microsoft has fought many times, and generally won, through competitive pricing, aggressive bundling, and deep manufacturer. Relationships built over decades. This is different. Lenovo and HP aren't launching a rival product to compete against Windows head-to-head. They're simply declining to make Windows the default anymore, on their own hardware, for their own financial reasons, using the exact same manufacturer relationships Microsoft spent decades cultivating, specifically to keep Windows as the automatic, unquestioned choice. Microsoft built its entire desktop dominance on the strength of those OEM partnerships, treating them for decades as one of the company's most durable and dependable competitive advantages, precisely because a manufacturer relationship, once established, tends to be far stickier and harder for a rival to disrupt than winning over individual consumers one at a time. Watching two of the largest partners in that exact relationship quietly redirect the default away from Windows, using their own internal cost-benefit analysis rather than any external pressure Microsoft could push back against, is a genuinely different and in some ways more structurally serious kind of challenge than a rival product launch would ever be. It's worth pointing out that this isn't actually the first time a major hardware category has successfully shipped without Windows as the default, which matters for how seriously to take the durability of what Lenovo and HP are now attempting. Chromebooks, running Google's Chrome OS, itself built on a Linux kernel, have spent well over a decade proving that an entire, genuinely successful hardware category can exist and thrive with zero dependency on Windows as the default operating system. Chromebooks carved out a real, durable niche specifically in education and budget computing, precisely by avoiding Windows licensing costs and hardware requirements entirely, and manufacturers across the industry have been comfortable shipping them as a default configuration for years, without it representing some radical, unprecedented business risk. Lenovo and HP's current move with Linux on mainstream laptops is, in a meaningful sense, applying that exact same proven playbook to a much larger, more general-purpose slice of the market than Chromebooks ever occupied. That precedent matters because it undercuts one of the more obvious objections to taking this shift seriously, the idea that manufacturers might simply reverse course the moment a modest wave of customer confusion or complaints rolls in. Chromebooks demonstrated over more than a decade of real market data that non-Windows defaults can survive and remain commercially viable long-term, not just as a temporary experiment. Lenovo and HP's own internal data, showing lower return rates and fewer support calls on their Linux configurations rather than more, suggests they're seeing early signs of that same durability, rather than the kind of customer backlash that would make a quick reversal likely. Let's talk about what this actually means for anyone shopping for a new laptop going forward, because the practical, everyday consequences of this shift are worth spelling out plainly. If you walk into buying a new Lenovo or HP laptop today without paying close attention to the configuration options, there's now a real, meaningful chance you'll end up with Linux pre-installed, rather than Windows, simply by taking whatever the default configuration happens to be. For a technically comfortable buyer who's been considering trying Linux anyway, that's a genuinely low-friction way to end up running it, sometimes without ever having deliberately decided to switch at all. For a buyer who specifically wants and needs Windows for work software, for gaming, for whatever reason. The practical takeaway is simple. Check the configuration carefully before you buy, because the assumption that a mainstream laptop automatically comes with Windows, unless you specifically go looking for a Linux branded machine, no longer holds the way it used to, at least across a meaningful share of the two largest manufacturers' lineups. It's worth connecting this back to everything else this channel has documented about Microsoft's position this year, because this story doesn't exist in isolation from everything else putting pressure on Windows right now. Millions of Windows 10 users were forced to confront alternatives after last October's end-of-support deadline locked working hardware out of security updates. Government agencies across Germany, Denmark, and Switzerland have been actively migrating away from Microsoft's ecosystem. Microsoft's own developer tools, WSL specifically, have broken repeatedly this year in ways that have pushed developers toward reconsidering their reliance on Windows entirely. And now, layered on top of all of that user-facing and developer-facing pressure, the actual hardware manufacturers responsible for putting Windows in front of customers in the first place are independently deciding, for their own financial reasons, that Windows no longer deserves automatic default status on their own product lines. Pressure from users leaving is one kind of problem for Microsoft to solve. Pressure from your own hardware partners quietly redirecting the default away from your product without waiting for your input or approval is a different and arguably more structurally dangerous kind of problem entirely. It's worth being precise, one more time, about what this shift does and doesn't prove, because overstating it would undercut the more careful, more accurate version of this story. Windows still runs on the overwhelming majority of the world's desktop and laptop computers. And that isn't changing overnight because two manufacturers adjusted their default configurations this year. Plenty have covered earlier. Software compatibility, gaming, institutional familiarity. This isn't the end of Windows as the dominant desktop operating system. But it is a genuine, measurable crack in one of the specific structural mechanisms that has protected that dominance for decades. The assumption that Windows simply is the default everywhere, without anyone needing to actively choose it. That assumption no longer holds universally across the two largest PC manufacturers on the planet. And once an assumption like that stops holding for the biggest players in the industry, it becomes considerably harder to argue. It will hold indefinitely for everyone else either. So here's the honest version of the title this video opened with. Nobody at Lenovo or HP literally stood up and announced that they no longer needed Microsoft's permission to run their own business. But permission, in any real functional sense, is exactly what changed here. For decades, the unwritten rule of the PC industry was that Windows was simply what your laptop ran unless you went far out of your way to choose otherwise, an arrangement that never required Microsoft to formally grant permission for anything, because no manufacturer at this scale had ever seriously challenged it. Lenovo and HP just proved that arrangement was never actually a rule at all. It was a habit. And once the two largest manufacturers on the planet demonstrated that the habit could simply be changed unilaterally for straightforward financial reasons, with no meaningful pushback Microsoft was able to prevent, the entire industry got a very clear, very public demonstration that permission was never really the thing holding this arrangement together in the first place. It's worth thinking about what happens next, because the incentive structure driving this shift doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. Every dollar Lenovo and HP save per unit by defaulting to Linux is a dollar of pure margin improvement or competitive pricing advantage they can use against manufacturers still defaulting to Windows. In an industry as brutally cost competitive as consumer laptop manufacturing, where margins are frequently measured in single-digit percentages, a genuine $100 per unit cost advantage isn't a small thing to ignore. If Dell and Asus are already reportedly running their own internal numbers on making the same switch, it's not hard to see why. Watching two direct competitors gain a real structural cost advantage without any corresponding drop in customer satisfaction based on the return rate and support call data already available creates exactly the kind of competitive pressure that tends to spread through an entire industry rather than stay contained to just the first movers. There's a broader lesson here too, worth naming directly, about what permission actually meant in this industry for most of its history. It was never a formal legal requirement written into any contract that manufacturers needed Microsoft's explicit sign-off before adjusting their own default configurations. It was simply an assumption so deeply embedded in how the entire industry operated that nobody at Lenovo's or HP's scale had ever seriously tested whether it was actually true. Once two of the largest manufacturers on the planet ran that test, quietly, through their own internal cost analysis, rather than any dramatic public confrontation, the answer turned out to be simple. The permission was never really there to begin with. It was just an assumption everyone had agreed to act on for long enough that it started to feel like a rule. If you want to see the fuller picture of everything else putting pressure on Windows this year, the Windows 10 migration wave, the real government departures from Microsoft's ecosystem, WSL's repeated reliability failures, the other videos covering those stories are linked right here because together they paint a much more complete picture of exactly how many different directions this pressure is coming from simultaneously. Let me know in the comments whether you've noticed this shift yourself while shopping for a new laptop recently, or whether Windows still showed up as the obvious default wherever you were looking. And if you've actually ended up with a Linux default machine from Lenovo or HP without originally planning to, tell us how that experience actually went, whether it felt like a smooth transition or a genuine adjustment, because real first-hand accounts from people actually living through this shift are worth more than any amount of industry analysis. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking exactly how much further this default is going to keep shifting, because based on what Dell and Asus are reportedly already considering, Lenovo and HP might not be the last two names on this list for very long.